Greetings everyone. It's a shame we can't do this in person, but we're going to do it online. So this is the ABTS2060 PEL presentation 2, Missions and Mainlanders, and I will be the only presenter today. Before we get into it, I want to do an acknowledgement of country. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and for their custodianship of the lands in which we're on today for this presentation. Today I'm on Yokara country at Karupa Point. I'd like to pay my respects to their ancestors and their descendants, as well as the continuing connections to country that exist. And I'd like to extend this respect to all communities in Australia, Torres Strait Islands, and beyond into the Pacific, and really on an international scale. Sovereignty was never ceded, the land underneath us is stolen, and it always will and always will be Aboriginal land. So let's get into it. So the question that I've chosen, and I've developed from the two resources, are how are Martin Nekada and Ruth Hegarty disrupting the dominant narrative about the identity of Indigenous peoples in Australia? So I'm going to break it down a little bit because there's a couple of points in here that I'm going to make. I'm going to spend a little time just doing an introduction and contextualizing the presentation I'm about to deliver. I'm going to spend some time doing some personal reflection and contextualization, and then I'm going to apply this to the contextualization of Nekada and Hegarty. And then we're going to discuss what they've done and where we think they're going to go, what opportunities have they provided for the future, and then we'll conclude, hopefully we'll leave some notes for everyone to reflect on into the future. And so to start, I would like to present this quote to kind of be the first thing in our minds, and that is that contrary to what many may think, like European people, Indigenous peoples had and continue to have their knowledge-producing machinery. And this is really going to be kind of the crux of this presentation, is the relationship between knowledge-producing machinery and how these people have contributed to that discourse. And you might be wondering on the bottom of your screen, who's this extra person? They're not meant to be here. They've really helped me to understand Hegarty and Nekada's position of their work a lot better, and we'll start by talking about positionality to get this conversation moving. So essentially, it's very important to acknowledge positionality. Why is this? Well, because I am not neutral. As much as I would like to be neutral, considered neutral, I am not. And it took me a while to learn this, and I was really only able to engage with this idea through writing from Kathy Obsalon and Cam Willett, who are of the opinion that neutrality and objectivity simply don't exist in research, and because research is conducted through human epistemological lenses, and that identifying the location of the voice of the researcher, which is me in this instance, is a way of ensuring that people like me who study, write, and participate in knowledge creation, like this presentation, that we are accountable, and we are accountable for our own positionality. So I wanted to discuss what I bring with me to the table, which is the lovely artist in the corner of our screen. And while I'm talking about what I bring with me, I'm going to define some key concepts that will be brought up throughout the conversation. So first of all, we all are, as human beings, positioned in certain ways within society. And what's more is that the ideas that we produce as human beings are positioned in certain ways within society, and that's what a lot of this conversation is going to be focused on. So I think it is important to kind of define what I think location is, and coming from Kathy Obsalon and Cam Willett, location is about the relationships to land, spiritual, cosmological, political, economical, environmental elements in one's life. It means revealing our identities to others, who we are, where we come from, and the experiences that have shaped these things, and what our intentions are for the work that we plan to do. And so a major issue is that within mainstream Australia, these positionalities that people embody are compared to different things. And unfortunately what's happened is we've got different positionalities, and they are referred in, well, they are in reference to the dominant narrative, which I will define in a moment. But when this is our way of thinking about the world, we get a deficit model because something is not at the standard of the dominant. It's not considered something else, it's considered within this overarching master narrative. And what the people what Nakada, Havini and Haggerty have done is they have all contributed to being able to have a space where the positionalities are not in reference to one dominant narrative. What they are is they are now separate things, and they have a relationship with each other. And that's what we're talking about. That's what these people have done, and what we're going to talk about through the presentation. And so in acknowledging this, I need to talk about what I'm bringing with me, and that's where the artist Taloi Havini comes in, which I will now introduce. So I'm doing this because the Taloi Havini and her art was the first mode, the first lens that I looked through to understand these two other individuals, which the majority of the presentation will be about. But I'm just going to contextualize it through Taloi Havini's work, and she is from an island called Bougainville. And Bougainville was also under, was subject to the cultural genocide that was experienced not only in Australia and Torres Strait, but also out of the Pacific. And so that's how they are connected in some way. And the other way, like I mentioned, they've all created mediums which me, as a non-Indigenous person, am able to access and use as a lens to understand issues that otherwise I won't be able to understand it if I'm trying to look at the dominant narrative from within the dominant narrative, I would be blind. So let's talk really quickly about Taloi Havini and how her art has provided a carved out space for thinking about different paradigms, about the interface between them rather than in comparison to them. So we'll briefly talk about that. So I've introduced this third person into this presentation because I believe that this piece of art really has orientated my thinking both before and especially when I started to work out how and what I was going to talk about in this presentation. So I do think it's really important to acknowledge what I'm bringing with me, and the way that I've framed this situation. This is my attempt to do it. So in a way, it awoke me, this piece of art, which is behind the text on your screen, awoke me to the extent of British and Australians imperialism into the Indo-Pacific region. Or at least what it taught me was that there's a lot that I don't know, and that there's a lot that I have to learn, and I'll explain why. A couple of years ago when I was studying Australian and Pacific Indigenous art, I learned a lot of things that changed or added the way that I see the world. But I was really, really confronted when I recontextualized ideas of development and globalization, which were previously positive notions to me. But when I was able to contextualize these through different lenses, which was Taloi Havini's art, it changed the way that I think. It really changed the way that I thought about Australia and globalization and expansionism quite immensely. And so it's been really influential, and it really has framed the way that I think about things. So the lens that I was looking through is the piece of art that you're looking at. And a piece of art, like a book or like a piece of literature, can act and does act as a vessel that holds knowledge, that acts as a reference for knowledge to be produced. In the installation that Telo Havini has made, it's the vessel, which is the artwork, holds knowledge from an island called Bougainville, which is located on that dot on your screen. And there's a lot of information about the island which is held within the artwork. And unfortunately, I shouldn't talk about it too much because of the time constraints. But crucially, what the art does is it questions whose wealth is more important. The installation is called Berona, in the local language, or shell money in English. And it's about the relationship between two different ways of being, doing, and knowing. And it's expressed through these two different systems, economies. The installation represents a string of shell money, currency, which was used on the island. Beyond the island, it was used in Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. And the aim of the artwork was to provide an economic alternative, that's the key word there, an economic alternative to better understand the dominant economy, which Australia went in and opened a big mine there, and it's caused a lot of conflict, environmental degradation, which has extended to people's identities. Taloe Havini says that the money embodies a relationship, shell money embodies a relationship-based economic system which cannot be compared to coins for which a government fixes the value. So this is really important in that an alternative has been imagined and has been presented to the population. And I'd love to talk about this more, but I can't. And you might be wondering, how is this related then? This is very off topic. Well, besides the fact that all three people are from three very different places, both culturally and geographically, with very diverse epistemologies, that all of these three places have been subjected to the same attempt of cultural genocide inflicted by the same Western capitalist cultural hegemony. So there's that connection too. But what I'm more interested in, why I'm bringing this up, is how these people are dealing with this. How are they resisting? How are they negotiating these immense power structures? And what we see is that all three of them are staging an intervention, whether it be through art or literature or academic text.
So the next two pieces of stimuli are quotes that I've worked with and referenced a lot while I've been doing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander studies at UQ, and it's something that I keep in mind on a day-to-day basis to try to measure my learning against. And it's because I see myself within these. So the first is from ABTS, and this is making the point that too few Australians are able to examine our shared colonial past seriously without averting their gaze from the unpalatable facts. This is something that I have struggled with throughout the course and the school, taking on all this knowledge. So I see this in myself and at the start of my journey in ABTS, I would turn my gaze away from the unpalatable facts. And now I'm just getting to a point where I'm able to reflect on this, actually consume the information, and then work out why I would avert my gaze in the first place. And the second one is from Simpson, which again I see myself in this a lot and I relate to it. And she says that for those of us who have grown up in a monocultural, monolingual environment where material things are a major measure of culture, I find it hard to conceive other ways of thinking and other ways of seeing the world. Again, I really see myself in this as well. So as a student, I need to navigate these dilemmas. I need to be able to navigate through this, and I argue that I would not be able to do this without engaging outside of the monolingual, monocultural society. As I said before, if I tried to learn about another way of knowing, being, and doing from within the dominant one, I would be blind, as I say. So to navigate these dilemmas, I rely on the lenses of others who do have a direct experience of the subject matter and are within the knowledge-producing machinery that the subject is about. So we know we have to do this because of the grave misrepresentations of Indigenous peoples, communities, and knowledges in the past, and which is having continued effects today. Not that it has finished. It's produced terrible harm, and it continues to inform the stereotyping of these identities today. So, with this, why don't we now turn to Ruth Hegarty and see how she is intervening in the dominant narrative regarding Indigenous identity. Ruth Hegarty is known for documenting her personal history as a human being, an Aboriginal woman, and a member of the stolen generation. In the chapter, Hegarty shared with the audience her experience of Cherbourg Mission, as it was known at the time, and the process of leaving the mission. So, Indigenous people's circumstances tied her relationship to non-Indigenous migration, and the dislocation of Indigenous people is a result of Indigenous land being acquired for new immigrants. And this has produced conditions where cultural traditions of an imagined homeland are infused with structures of subordination and oppression in the new country, producing a hybridity of identity, is a quote that I'm using to understand Hegarty at the moment. And in the chapter, Hegarty shares that as she arrived there at the age of 6 months old, that meant that, quote, my roots were here. Everything I was has developed out of this life. I knew no other. So it's a kind of seeing what she is, how she is being positioned, and it's in relativity to the mission system. And her story evokes a history of cultural genocide in this country. The deficit models that I talked about before, used to subordinate and oppress Indigenous people, led to the policies of assimilation, and some call it cognitive imperialism, being justified because of the way that these people are positioned. It's not in relativity to themselves. It's in relativity to this dominant narrative I keep talking about. So Hegarty has placed a lot of importance on the future and the notion of building a better future, especially for Indigenous futures. We can see that she was positioned in relativity to the mission system through the quote from the text that reads, "I lived my life under a system whose history was notorious for the deprivation of the liberties of its inmates." And then this, in combination with the speech made for the QATSIF, the Queensland Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Foundation, a scholarship program, Hegarty has said that something that we, as the stolen generation, all grew up with was trying to achieve that good person in labouring and, of course, being servants. The speeches and the scholarships that she's referring to are funded by the stolen wages from these times. So yeah, that's about trying to achieve what was set which was, or were trying to achieve the parameters of the mission system, which was, like she says, laboring or being a servant. But so what Hayley's trying to do, I think, and the clues are in this speech I'm talking about, which is referenced on the screen. And she says that these scholarships will enable you to rise above the servant or laborer. She says that when I started working with book and pen when I was 70 years old, I hadn't realized that I could speak out and let my voice be heard. So writing these books that would tell you of the life that we lived and is to encourage you to say that I can't go back to that. I'll never go back to what our nanas and mums lived through. I want to go further, is what she's, the message I guess she's attached, or I'm at least picking up on. And a really good quote that I think encapsulates Haggerty is, enabling you to do what we could not. So in the West, we love a dichotomy, which has presented problems now that this overt assimilation is in terms of mission style is over. So in the dominant culture there's a notion that you're either indigenous or non-indigenous. Like I said, we love the dichotomy. So now there are new characteristics and parameters that have been placed on indigenous people surrounding authenticity. But Haggerty disrupts this notion in the telling of her story. I think that this hybridity of identity is really highlighted by in the story when Haggerty was forced to go to the inland indigenous mission churches, the AIM churches, so the Aboriginal inland mission churches. And she tells in the story that she didn't like to go. She was made to go 3 times a week. But while she was there, she's funneled into this way of thinking about the world, and she still had these connections with other people who were living in the mission. She refers to her sisters, and they would look after the children. Like during her wedding, they were looking after the baby, dressing the baby up and sharing the responsibility. And then back to the wedding, her uncle walks her to the church for the half an hour walk to the church. So there's that connection too. And I think what the effect of the book is it's Haggerty saying, like breaking out of these assigned parameters that have been put over her and saying, yes, I'm real, I exist, and this is my experience. It happened and it has shaped me, and I'm a real person. So it's carving out a space where her identity and her perspectives and the other people in her community in a similar situation are affirmed. So similarly to the way that Haggerty has carved a space out of the master narrative to express herself, Nakata has similarly resisted the dominant narrative place over Islander culture and Islander knowledge itself. It took me a really long time to realize this, but not only have we been reading Nakata's work over the years, but we've also been learning through some of Nakata's methodologies, his methodology of education as a decolonizing praxis. So Nakata too is living in the future to address past past misrepresentations of Islander culture, communities, and most importantly, their knowledge. So the aim of the book, disciplining the savages and savaging the disciplines, the aim is to act as a starting point in one's thinking that gives them the ability to change the way that they think about the world. Nakata states that understanding the theoretical and methodological issues is critical to producing new and more effective approaches to negotiating the intersections of different knowledge systems as they converge, circumscribe, and condition the possibilities for both understanding the past and its legacies while improving Indigenous futures. The title of the book itself is a bit of tongue-in-cheek, and it's a bit of a summary of the aim as well. The term disciplining the savages relates to the notion that members of the Torres Strait Islander community were perceived as savages in that they did not kind of meet the European standard of what civilization could look like. And because of this deficit model, a lot of effort on the behalf of the London Missionary Society was put into disciplining the savages. And this is kind of related to Haggerty's story as well, when we think about it. The next part is savaging the disciplines, and this relates to NACADA's efforts and others to establish a space within universities that is recognisably Indigenous, a space formed by inserting and asserting content, practices and processes that culturally affirm Indigenous people, students, communities, and perspectives. So, I guess I have a lot to thank NACADA for, in that if I were not to engage with NACADA's work, I really don't believe that I'd be able to, I don't think I would be able to have achieved the interpretations of the world that I have today, which I like to think is along the lines of negotiating different knowledge structures is what I'm aiming towards. But I would say that NACADA has really succeeded in this, considering that this is what we're doing right now, and this is the way we've been learning, well, I've been learning throughout my time in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander studies. Because of the time, I think this is where I'm going to leave it, but thank you for listening. And if I'm to leave a takeaway note for you to reflect on, I would like you to think of how you are positioned within certain knowledge structures, and see how, if you changed your appearance, in terms of gender, let's say, what do you think the differences would be in the way that you are now positioned within the dominant narrative? Thank you.